Hello, and welcome to Stour Valley Baptist Church's series leading up to Christmas, our Advent series, exploring what it is to see more of the one who came to be seen. I'm Daniel, I'm the pastor at Stour Valley, and it's my pleasure to give you this second in our series leading up to Christmas. I'm always very nervous talking about football because I'm only too well aware that anybody that knows me will know that I don't know very much about it at all. But I was listening quite a lot last week to the radio, and it was telling me all about extra time and the fact that England had in its match versus Iran quite a lot of extra time, 17 minutes of extra time, and 16 seconds were added to that game alone. And it would appear, to those that know these things, that this World Cup is being characterised by quite a lot of extra time being added to each game. And it struck me that stuff happens in extra time. It's a really interesting thing, extra time. In the 2018 World Cup, 15% of the goals scored in the entire tournament were in either the 90th minute or in extra time. Of the 21 finals that have been played in terms of World Cups, 7 have actually gone into extra time, including England's great 1966 win. And the 3 consecutive finals before 2018, each of those went into extra time. I really hope you're making notes, because one day you may be, with this information, the hero of a quiz team. Just when you think it's all over, extra time can be a game changer. And when I've thought about it, Jesus is all about what happens in extra time. At the end of each of the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, he dies. Big spoiler alert for anyone new to Christianity. Jesus dies. A horrible, ugly public death, crucified on a wooden cross. And in the natural, that would be the full-time whistle. Game over. And when we read accounts such as in Mark's Gospel, chapter 15, that's exactly how it reads. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. And when he learnt from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph brought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Now, what they were doing was preparing a body for burial. They weren't making temporary arrangements for a body that they expected to be back to life again anytime soon. This is final resting place rituals. And when the women return on Sunday morning, it was not with the expectation of encountering new life. It is to perform the rituals of death that they hadn't been able to do due to pressure of time on Friday. No one thought it was all over. As far as they were concerned, they knew it was all over. End of. But when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here." Fantastic stuff. And when we read those verses, you see, we are entering extra time. It was not just a game changer, it was a world changer. And as I've been sort of thinking and exploring this theme, I've been thinking about Jericho too. That great fortified city which stood between the people and the promised land back in Joshua chapter 6. And in that chapter, Joshua chapter 6, the Lord tells Joshua to get the people to walk around these impregnable city walls once a day for 6 days, with all the armed men and with 7 priests carrying trumpet ram's horns in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And on the 7th day they were to also walk around. But when this time the people heard the ram's horns being sounded, the people were to give a loud shout. So, day 1 came and went. Day 2 came and went, and they duly trotted around the walls of Jericho, blasting their trumpets. Days 3 and 4 came and went with exactly the same routine. All the while, the inhabitants of Jericho must have been up on the city walls, pointing and laughing at them and pouring scorn on them, thinking they were complete idiots. By day 6, not a single crack had formed in the city's walls, and the novelty must have well and truly worn off. By 7, they could have been forgiven if they were less than enthusiastic to walk around the city again, and this time to shout with all their might when the trumpets were sounded. And yet, it was then, in the biblical equivalent of the 90th minute, at the end of extra time as it were, the Bible states 3 simple words: the walls collapsed. What if they'd only gone round 3 or 4 or even 6 times? What if they'd believed Joshua had simply misheard, got it wrong? I've also noticed and been really impacted by a little detail that was in a book I was reading that you've probably never noticed before either. And it comes in 2 Kings chapter 14. And at this point in time, the great prophet Elisha, who's been a spiritual guide to the country of Israel and to its kings, Elisha is about to die. And the king, who faces great threats to his kingdom on all sides, comes to Elisha. And he says this. Elisha said, "Get a bow and some arrows." And he did so. "Take the bow in your hands," he said to the king of Israel. And when he'd taken it, Elisha put his hands on the king's hands. "Open the east window," he said, and he opened it. "Shoot," Elisha said, and he shot. "The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram," Elisha declared. "You will completely destroy the Arameans at Aphek." Then he said, "Take the arrows," and the king took them. Elisha told him, "Strike the ground," and he struck it 3 times and stopped. The man of God was angry with him and said, "You should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it. But now you will defeat it only 3 times." Elisha died and was buried. Now, I know that we are crashing into the narrative here, but does the thing that struck me strike you as well? There was clearly a lot going on here, I think more than meets the eye. But the king ends up effectively being told that he will not ever completely defeat one of his biggest enemies all because he only struck the arrows on the ground 3 times. And Elisha hadn't stipulated how many times he should hit the arrows on the ground. He'd left it intriguingly, frustratingly, open-ended. But King Jehoash randomly decided to stop at 3. And it makes me wonder, why did he stop? Did he think that a 4th strike would simply not add any added value? Wouldn't make any difference? Was he concerned not to damage the arrows too much? We just aren't told why he stopped. Was he tired? Maybe he thought it was just ridiculous. Maybe he thought it was beneath him. He was a king and he's just having to bang these arrows on the ground. Couldn't see the point. But it's clear that for Elisha, the fact the king stopped striking the arrows, that was connected to the king's determination to receive the full measure of God's intention for him. He stopped, quit, and the victory was lost. He just didn't want it badly enough. And it always amazes me how just one line, one verse in the Bible can be so powerful, can rattle around in your head and kind of explode in your mind. I wonder if that ever happens with you. But I kept thinking, why did he stop? Why did he stop? He clearly hadn't realised how so much of the Bible is about God doing something in the 90th minute, in extra time. And the thing that hit me again and again is that we're not born to die with a quiver full of perfectly intact arrows. We were born to use what God had given us. Had that king kept on striking the ground with those arrows till those arrows were snapped and blunted and completely useless, he would not have been the poorer. He would have been victorious, known probably as one of Israel's greatest ever kings. I'm not too sure how those verses land with you, but for me they shocked me into reflecting on how often I stop praying. I set aside a period of time to pray, and then I stop. And I felt the Spirit was prompting me to pray more and to spend more time with our God, simply being still and seeking him, asking to know Jesus better. Now, those of you who are regular here will know that I recently was on sabbatical, and not all my plans on my sabbatical actually came off. They didn't happen, which actually turned out to be a far better plan than the one I started with. And one of the big impacts that it had was that I had far more time to read and to pray and to be still with God. And I also felt that God was showing me in other ways the rewards of time intentionally invested. Of course, this is nothing new, really. It's kind of more of a reminder to me than a lightning bolt of new revelation. But as I grappled with it, I realised this is a real difference maker. So I'm sharing it with you. Let's never underestimate the time we spend in prayer. I read somewhere, I can't remember where, a quote from Oswald Chambers, a great evangelist of the past century, and he wrote, "Prayer does not fit us for the greater work. Prayer is the greater work." It's quite a striking statement. Prayer does not fit us for the greater work. Prayer is the greater work. At the beginning of Mark's Gospel, you saw a little hint of something there. At the beginning of Mark's Gospel, Jesus is baptized by John in the Jordan, and there is then a miraculous voice from heaven affirming him. "You are my son, whom I love. With you I'm well pleased." But we don't really dwell on that awesome moment for very long in Mark's Gospel, because the very next verse says, "At once the Spirit led Jesus into the desert for 40 days, being tempted by Satan." And I've grown to really love, I say love, I found it deeply challenging, but I really appreciate the insight that John Mark Comer has into that word desert. It's actually a Greek word. Mark's Gospel was written in Greek, so it's an ancient Greek word, eremos. And it has many overlapping meanings. Eremos can mean desert. It can also mean a deserted place, a desolate place, a solitary place, a lonely place, a quiet place, wilderness. And the insight that John Mark Comer has is that for years, and I think I put myself in the same camp, frankly, he got the fact that the whole biblical narrative had been leading up to a toe-to-toe confrontation between Jesus and the devil, between Jesus and evil. It had to happen, sure as sure, no surprises there at all. But what Mark Comer, and frankly I myself, could never really understand was why it had to happen in the desert, in the wilderness, when Jesus is hungry, when Jesus is alone, when Jesus was weak. And then he says he got it. He realised that he'd got it completely the wrong way round. The wilderness, the desert, the quiet place is not a place of weakness. It's a place of strength. Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, into the desert, because it was there and only there that Jesus was at the height of his spiritual powers. It was only after a month and a half of fasting and praying in that quiet place that Jesus had the capacity to take on the whole realm, the whole forces of the devil himself, and walk away unscathed. You see, you'd think after 40 days in the desert fasting and praying, and after encounter with Satan himself offering him all the world could offer him on a plate, that Jesus would kind of stumble out of the desert, out of the wilderness, the quiet place, victorious, but utterly shattered and exhausted. But not a bit of it. In Luke's account of these events, in Luke chapter 4 verse 14, it says, Luke records that Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. No mention of exhaustion, no mention of weakness. He goes through all of that and comes out in the power of the Spirit. Mark 1 gives us a great example, actually, of this eremos factor. And Mark writes in a rush. If you've picked up the challenge from last week to read Mark's Gospel, you have noticed it's a fast read. Everything happens instantly, at once, immediately. But that, in a sense, helps to underline the fullness of a day in Jesus' life. And in this case, in Mark chapter 1, it's his first full day as Messiah. He started the day in verse 21, teaching in a synagogue, which led him to delivering a man from an evil spirit. Just another day in the office. Over lunch, he healed Peter's mother-in-law, which prompted the whole town to bring their sick to him for healing. It turned into a late one. But the next day, instead of taking it easy and pressing the snooze button, Jesus is up and he's out and off to a solitary place, the eremos. And something happens whilst he's there. The disciples eventually find him and they are clutching the morning's front pages. Jesus is headline news in all of the local rags. People have been after him for a spot on morning TV. The first century equivalent of Oprah has been on the phone. You get the picture. But something has happened in the eremos. And Jesus has a clear focus because he's had that time. No, they're not going to stay there. They're going to move. They're going to be on the move to the next village and the next village. And did you notice that Jesus, he's just spent a month and a half in the desert praying and fasting. He's had just one day on the job in Capernaum, and now he's out first thing in the morning back to the Eremos, the quiet place. Doesn't that speak of a priority, a pattern for his days? And that pattern seeps into the narrative of Jesus' life again and again. Luke's Gospel alone records Jesus going into the Eremos, the desert, the quiet places, some 9 times. Whilst I was in the bush in South Africa on my sabbatical, I felt God was underlining something for me. Now, I readily realised that not everyone has the privilege of going on safari, and in truth, God has often spoken to me here in Elm Road in Shipston on Stour, or walking around the roads and pathways surrounding this town. But on this occasion I happened to be in Africa, so that's where God spoke to me. And I had gone to a part of Kruger National Park called Sabi Sands, which is one of the best places in Africa to see leopards. And every time we'd set off in a jeep, I'd made it very clear that that's what I wanted to see. Derek, our driver, would turn around at the beginning of each safari drive and go, say, what do you want to see today? And most of my fellow safari passengers were kind of, well, what you know the park, what can you share us? You know better than me, what's out there? I was like single-minded, I want to see leopards. But as someone pointed out to me recently, they are largely nocturnal. So this was a big ask, and in reality, on that first day, we didn't see a hint of a leopard. Gone out there at 6 a.m. in the morning, not a hint. And we'd been out on our second drive of the day. We started at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, and we were about to head back. It was almost 7 o'clock in the evening. We about to head back when a message came through on the radio in the jeep that the leopard was on the move the other side of the reserve. And Derek, our guide, turned round and said, there's a leopard on the move. Are you interested? Are you interested? So he took us on what he called a Ferrari safari, which was basically off-roading at speed. And we arrived the other side of the park in darkness. We could only see with the help of a big flashlight torch. But this is what we saw.
Känning att det ska straight to it. Vi bygger man med det. Vi just cutting in the more motivation and in farmer and taking care of the people.
Okay, bro, I'm gonna be there now.
Now, I don't know if you've ever gone watching wildlife at home or overseas, but seeing something like that right in front of you, walking past the truck where you're sitting, was just spine-tingling, totally thrilling. And actually, I had the privilege of seeing a leopard in the last 10 minutes, really, of each evening drive that we went on. I'd been bouncing around in the back of a jeep since 6 a.m. in the morning, and it was only at 6:45 p.m. that we actually saw leopards. And I kind of I did the maths, and I realised we went on 2 3-hour game drives a day for 4 days. That's 6 hours a day, 24 hours in total looking for leopards. No surprise in many ways that we got to see a few. And I just felt, as I was kind of thinking that one through, that God was speaking to me and saying, look what you see when you don't quit. Look what you see in the last few minutes when you're prepared to put in the extra time. And sometimes I think God has a hard job speaking to me. You may be far more receptive. I kind of need things written in the stars sometimes for me to understand what God's saying to me. And as if I hadn't got the message, on my very last day, I was heading out. Derek and another guide were driving me through Kruger National Park to the local little airstrip, where I was going to catch a flight out of there to Johannesburg and on. So I was on the way to the airport, and suddenly Derek stopped the car and he pointed to all the impala, their little antelope, and you could see that all of their ears were up and their eyes were absolutely all fixed in one direction, and they were rigid, watching. And Derek, who obviously is a guide, he can read animal behaviour, he said something is on the move. So we sat there for a few moments, and then this happened.
Going to the airport never been so fun.
How incredible.
That's mad.
Oh, you can go for it.
Well, I was utterly bowled over. A leopard walking past our car in broad daylight, bold as brass. These were a couple of photos that I was able to take out of the car window as it walked past. But this was a drive to the airport. I've never been on a drive to an airport that has been that exhilarating. But there it was. And there it was. It was a drive to the airport. In literally the 90th minute. In fact, it wasn't the 90th minute. I was packed. I was on the way home, as it were. I long thought it was all over, but it wasn't. And that has really stuck with me. That experience, that underlining that stuff happens in the very last moment. That you can see stuff if you hang in, if you persevere. So I've come back really challenged, and I'm trying to rise to that challenge. And I do like to share. So I'm just passing on the challenge to the church here, and if you're watching from elsewhere, I challenge you too. This Advent, as a church here, we're focusing on seeing more of Jesus. And last Sunday, in part 1 of this series, I was challenging us to read Mark's Gospel between now and Christmas, either in one go or in different little chunks. And this week I challenge you, and it's more of an encouragement really, but I certainly challenge you to spend extra time with God in the eremos, in prayer, in the desert, in the quiet place. And I don't make any assumptions. Maybe you don't spend any time in prayer every day anyway, in which case it won't be extra time, it'll just be time, maybe for the first time in your life. Or maybe you're able, and it's not a challenge for you at all, but you can easily spend an extra hour a day, simply being with God in quiet prayer and stillness. Or you might be thinking, listening to this, that you'll be lucky to squeeze in an extra 10 minutes between now and Christmas. I just simply encourage you to get some time when you can be still, and that is the key, to be still. I could talk further about my experience of being in deserts, but the one thing that's always struck me when I've been in a desert is the silence. If I've been wearing a wristwatch at the time, I can just hear it ticking loudly by my side. And I know that some of you are listening to this or watching this and you're thinking, that just isn't real. This man has been on a sabbatical and he's just lost touch. He's been in an ivory tower and has come back with all these ridiculous notions and ideas. You know, our lives simply don't lend themselves to being quiet. Well, actually, I never said it was easy, and I deliberately used the word challenge. Get some time. Some undistracted time where you can simply pray. And by that I mean simply pray that God would be revealing more to you, either through the Word as you read it, or just by your everyday life, in the same way that I was sitting in a Jeep and I was thinking about how that was an analogy to having quiet time with God and being more intentional about how much time I spent with Him. God can speak to you through ordinary things that you're doing. And maybe you don't know where to start. Maybe it's about just being still and reading Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 to 11, which speak about just the majesty of Jesus. And as you do that, or after you've done that, just pray that the Spirit would help you to understand more of Jesus' power, of His love, of His ways. Pray that God will be opening your mind and your heart to understand more about Him and why He came. And know that God is the God of the 90th minute. Let us be prepared to keep striking our prayer arrows. Let's not settle for less than all that God wants to reveal to us. The Jesus in the manger that we will be remembering in just, amazingly, 4 Sundays' time on Christmas Day. The Jesus in the manger is God in a high-vis jacket. This is a picture I saw recently that we're using in this series, but it's not in many ways the best picture I've ever seen in my life. But what strikes me about it is the light that's coming from the baby that's lying there in the manger. And the more I look at that picture, I realise that I think it's the shepherds that are gathered around. They're having to shield their eyes from the light that's coming from the manger. And it just underlines to me that Jesus was God in a high-vis jacket. He was not hiding. He wanted to be seen, wanted to be known, and He still does. So I encourage you to give Him some extra time to do that revealing, that showing that you can know Him better. Because when we know Jesus better, we grow in our confidence, in our praying to Him. We grow in boldness, in living for Him, and our lives become more authentically His, because we know what He's like and what we need to be like. And in our sharing, we can tell the truth about Jesus more and more, because we know more and more about Him. So try. Aim to have some eremos time, some extra time to be quiet with Jesus over the coming weeks. Thank you for listening.